Hello, good evening, everyone. Now, thank you all so much for being here for another instalment of our Birds Meet webinars. For those of you who don't know me, my name is Dr. Annie Namo, and I coordinate the Urban Birds program at BirdLife Australia. So that's our Birds in Backyards program as well. And I'm really happy to be joined tonight by Dr. Sara Ryding, who has just finished her PhD at Deakin, which is down in Melbourne. And she's going to be talking to us tonight about the morphological and other effects of climate change on bird species in Australia. And it's probably a really salient time to be thinking about these things. And I know that even though I am lucky enough to work as an ecologist, there's so many aspects of our global change that are having huge knock-on effects that I don't understand. So I'm really looking forward to what Sarah has to share. Before I hand it over to her, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of the lands that myself and I believe Sarah is calling in from, so the Wurundjeri people of the Kulin Nation, and caring for country, whether it be about climate change or habitat conservation, is a really big part of acknowledging country. So that's a cool opportunity to do that. Now, throughout the night, just some housekeeping. If you've got any questions, you can pop them all in the chat and I'll compile them, and then at the end we can ask them all to Sarah. And if you're having any technical difficulties, also pop that in the chat. And it's not my expertise, but I promise that I will do my best to try and figure it out for you. But yeah, that's everything, and I will hand it to you, Sarah.
Right. Sure. Let me share my screen first and do those bits and bobs. So you should be able to see that now, I think, right?
Perfect. Yeah.
Fantastic. And I'm assuming everyone can hear me mostly?
I hope so.
Okay. I'll start going and you can stop me if there's any issues there. Great. Okay, so yes, hi everyone. As Annie said, I'm Sarah and I'm based at Deakin University in Melbourne. And I'm going to be talking to you a little bit about the work that I did during my PhD. So before I start, I know that Annie already did this, but I also want to just do a quick acknowledgement of country. I'm working on the lands of the Wurundjeri people, but I'd also like to extend that respect to Indigenous Australians across the country, because the work that I have done and the work that I continue to do spans spans the land of lots of traditional custodians. So let's get into the science. I'm going to be talking to you about climate change and how it influences body shape, which is a topic that we've called shape-shifting. And I'm going to get into why we call it shape-shifting a little bit later. So just to outline the structure of my talk for you tonight, we're going to start by covering just a bit of background information. I'm going to be talking a little bit about climate change and how birds deal with the heat and deal with high temperatures. Then I'm going to move into some research I did when I started my PhD, where I reviewed scientific literature for evidence of body shape changes through time. Then I'm going to talk about some research that I did on Australian birds and how they are changing beak and leg size in response to climate change. And then finally, I'm going to cover some of the remaining questions in this research sphere before just concluding about what we have talked about. So I'm sure I don't need to say this, but in case there's any doubt about the nature of this presentation, climate change is very real, and it has some very real impacts on wildlife, including on Australian wildlife. For example, climate change influences the speed or the timing of events that happen throughout the year. This article was published just a few days ago, and it's about how birds are migrating earlier in the year and arriving at their breeding grounds earlier in the year. And we call this changes in phenology, so the changes in the timing of an event. But there's also other changes that are happening because of climate change. This article is from a few years ago, and it's about birds that are showing up in unexpected places. So this bird showed up in Australia, whereas its historical normal distribution is in Papua New Guinea. So climate change might be causing birds to explore new environments as they become more suitable. So as the world warms, climates that were previously too cold for birds are becoming more accessible, and so they move into those climates. And this, we call these changes in distributions of birds. And so both changes in the timing of events and changes in the distribution of birds are attributed, at least in part, to rising temperatures. But temperature, of course, has some more direct impacts on animals across the world, including on us, because we need to regulate our body temperature. And that's a defining trait for so-called warm-blooded animals. We regulate our internal temperature to keep it steady. And that means that when it gets hot and when temperatures are rising, it might become harder to regulate that body temperature. So there are different ways to deal with heat to make sure that your body temperature is stable. Humans can sweat, but many animals can't do this. For example, birds tend to engage in this, which is a type of panting behavior. So the bird is releasing heat through this panting that you can see it doing on the video. But they also have another secret weapon, which is regulating heat through their beaks and through their legs. So this image right here on the slide is a thermal image, and that is basically a picture of the temperatures. And as you can see on it, we have a puffin, and you can see that the beak of the puffin is a lot warmer than the rest of its body. And that's because it's losing extra body heat through that beak. And birds can do this because their beaks are heavily vascularized. There's lots of little blood vessels that go throughout the beak. And that means that when a bird gets hot, they can flood those blood vessels with hot blood and then passively release that heat to the environment. So for example, this video shows a toucan that is regulating its bill temperature. So you can see as it gets warmer, it is flooding that beak and all those little blood vessels with warm blood that then gets released passively to the environment, and the beak can cool down. The bird can stop flooding those blood vessels with hot blood, and it can instead stop losing heat. And you can sort of also see the same thing happening with the legs, which are down here at the bottom of the video. You can see it sort of clutching the stick that it's sitting on. So birds can use both their beaks and their legs to help them in heat loss. And so these are the areas of the bird that aren't insulated with feathers, and they can use those areas to regulate their body temperature. But other warm-blooded animals can do similar things. So, for example, rabbits can use their big ears to release extra body heat when they get really warm. So, the use of beaks and ears and legs in regulating body temperature, it leads to some really neat patterns in body shape that we can see. So, animals, warm-blooded animals that live in colder environments like the Arctic, they tend to have smaller ears and beaks and legs than animals that live in hotter environments like desert environments. So a hare in the Arctic has small ears because it wants to retain all of its heat. It's a very cold environment, and so it doesn't want to release heat to the environment. So therefore it has small ones. While a desert jackrabbit has much bigger ears because they really want to maximize the amount of heat that they're losing to the environment. And by having bigger ears, there's more surface available for them to lose heat from. And that's a good thing when you're in a warm environment and you're really trying to maximize the heat loss. And so we see these trends in body shape that happen across space, moving from cold environments to hot environments. And we call this trend Allen's rule, wherein animals in hotter environments have bigger ears or beaks or legs than animals in colder environments. And so the presence of these types of trends in body shape through space has led to some people to question, okay, well, do they also exist through time? We might predict similar trends through time as the climate warms. So for example, a fox in pre-climate change times might have had smaller ears than those who have been impacted by climate change for a few decades. And so when I started my PhD, which was 5 years ago now, I looked into any evidence that this was occurring. So I wanted to see if there were examples of animals or that in the 1850s, had smaller beaks compared to those in the 21st century. And so I looked through the scientific literature, trying to find examples of mammals and birds changing body shape through time. And we called these changes in body shape shape-shifting because the overall proportions or shape of the animal were changing. So we're not talking about werewolves here, but we are talking about changes in body shape. And looking through the scientific literature, I found lots of examples of changes in body shape through time as the climate warmed. So for example, we found it in Australian parrots. I found it in red knots, in bats that were based in China, and then in shrews that were based up in Alaska. So we had all of these examples occurring where traits such as beak size were increasing for the birds, wing size was increasing for the bats, and tail size was increasing for the shrews. And it's also notable that all of these examples are from very different parts of the world. So it was Australian parrots increasing bill size. The red knots up there at the top that were increasing bill size were in Europe, but of course they migrate from the Arctic down to Africa every year. The bats were based in China and the shrews were up in Alaska. So all over the world, we saw these changes in body shape as the climate warmed. We published this research, this review of the scientific literature in 2021. And I'm going to show you some of the feedback that we got for that. So we got some really exciting attention from the press and included stuff on Twitter. For example, Richard Dawkins tweeted about our research, which was super exciting. We also had Vice, the magazine, write up an article about our research, which was really exciting in itself. And then I started getting a bunch of Twitter notifications because this article had been retweeted by a woman called Erica Jane. And I thought, I don't know who this Erica Jane woman is, and I'm assuming many of you don't either. But it turns out that she's one of the Real Housewives of Beverly Hills. So it was kind of exciting that this science reached really widely across the world in all kinds of walks of life. We also got some other feedback from Twitter, as it were, including people telling us that it wasn't anything to do with climate change, but was about the 5G rollout, or, that it was about chemtrails rather than climate change. And then finally, just that our article was garbage from a scientific point of view. So, we got lots of feedback. But to go back to the science, we found lots of scattered examples. We found it happening. We found changes in body shape in birds, in mammals. We found increases in beak size, increases in tail size, increases in wing size. And we found it happening all across the world. But all of these scattered examples are not super helpful for figuring out the details of what's happening and predicting what species are going to be impacted. So for example, was beak size changing differently depending on diet? Because beaks are obviously quite closely tied to what a bird eats. For example, was beak size changing in birds that eat nectar, such as our beautiful rainbow lorikeets, but also in birds of prey? We couldn't tell that based off of the previous examples because they were too scattered. Similarly, birds can differ really drastically in their movement behavior. So some birds migrate across the world every year for experiencing a range of different climates as they fly from continent to continent. But other birds are our neighbors year-round, for better or for worse. So does the different type of movement behavior influence whether or not their beak and leg size is changing through time? And then finally, how widespread is this shape-shifting, this increasing beak and leg size? How widespread is that across the avian tree of life? Does it occur in ducks as well as magpies and everything ranging in between, or is it restricted to certain groups? So these questions formed the basis for another chapter of my PhD. Are changes in bill and leg size occurring really through time as the climate warms consistently? Is it influenced by diet and movement? And does it occur across the entire avian tree of life? And another thing that was important to find out with regards to these categories is that if we see consistent trends in shape-shifting throughout these different groups and across really diverse species of birds, we can say with more certainty that changes in beak and leg size through time are not driven by changes in their food source or something else, but are rather driven by what they all have in common, which is unfortunately climate change. So, Australian birds are a fantastic system to study this. For one, Australian birds have there's a great diversity of birds in Australia. We have birds of all different types of diet categories that feed on all different types of food, ranging from the huge birds of prey like our wedge-tailed eagles to the nectar feeders and the insect feeders, all kinds. Also have birds of different movement behaviors. So Australia is home to some migratory species that undertake one of the longest migrations in the world of any animal. And Australia is home to a massive host of different species from all types of different groups of birds. Another reason that Australia is a great system to study this in is that warming has been found to occur across Australia. So if we see changes through time, we have strong reason to suspect it's linked to this climate warming. But how am I supposed to compare the size of beak that a bird had in 1910 to the size of beak it had in 2010? I am not capable of time travel, for better or worse, which probably for better that I'm not capable. But how am I supposed to study this phenomenon? And that's another reason that Australia is great, because Australia has some fantastic museum collections, and these museums host thousands of bird specimens that have been collected throughout history. And that means that we can go into a museum, find a bird that was collected in 1910, and compare it to a bird that was collected in 2010. And we can find birds throughout between those time periods too, and track that change through time. So what I did and how I measured birds was using a 3D surface scanner. Now, the 3D surface scanner is the thing in the middle that sort of looks like a clothes iron. And using this clothes iron, you can go from a museum specimen that looks like this to a fully manipulable 3D model, such as the one here on the right. And from that 3D model, you can extract a measurement of the beak surface area. So we can measure the surface area that's available for heat loss for that bird when it was alive. And so I did this for a whole host of different species from all these Australian museums. And in the end, I had over 5,000 specimens that I had measured over the past century. And the specimen that I had measured came from a really diverse collection of diet categories. So I had 5 different diet categories, which included birds of prey, so anything that eats vertebrates or fish or is a scavenger. I had plant and seed eaters, insectivores, so anything that eats bugs, omnivores, so anything that eats, more than just one food source, and then fruit and nectar feeders at the end. I had birds of different movement behaviors. So I had birds that were fully migratory, undertaking significant migrations to new locations. I had birds that were nomadic, so they made sort of scattered movements, typically within Australia to different locations, but not quite broad or dramatic enough to be classified as migratory. And then we had the non-migratory birds, which were the year-round residents. And all of my specimen ended up coming from 78 different species, ranging from ducks up to songbirds and everything in between. I ended up having penguins, birds of prey, pigeons, parrots, most things. You name it, and there's a chance that I had it in my data set. So we had this fantastic diversity of things that we had measured. And the question was, is there shape-shifting through time as the climate warms? As the climate warms, do beaks and legs become bigger? So if this was the case, if shape-shifting was occurring, we'd expect bill and leg size to increase through time. So we're expecting to see a positive change per decade. And that is exactly what we found. We found that both bill and leg length increased through time. And overall, they both increased by around 2% over the past century, which is quite a lot when you consider all the different species and all the different things that they do. We also found that these changes in beak and leg size through time were consistent across different diet categories. So the increases were similar in birds that ate invertebrates, such as this gray shrike thrush, birds that ate plants and seeds, like this bronzewing, birds of prey, like this brown falcon, and the silver gull, which is an omnivore. We found consistent changes in all of these different categories. The exception were the fruit and nectar feeders. They weren't at all, they were an outlier from the other sort of categories, and they weren't doing the same thing. So we found mostly consistent changes in bill size through time, with the exception being fruit and nectar feeder. However, we only had 2 species that fit this category, so we didn't have lots of power in teasing apart what they were doing differently or why. We also found quite consistent increases in beak and leg size through time across different movement behaviors. So our full migrants, which go from Australia to the Arctic or Australia to further afield, every year increased beak and leg size to a similar extent as those who undertake nomadic movements, such as the shining bronze cuckoo. And then again, to a similar extent as the residents, such as this white-bellied cuckoo shrike. Now, looking across the 78 species, lots of them were increasing in beak and leg size through time. And that's what you see here in the red. So all the ones with red blobs are increasing. And you can see that that's happening quite a lot for both beak size and for leg size. But you're also going to notice that there's lots of variability here. So all these points in blue are dissenting from that trend. But what I want to point out here is that this variability from what we found is not driven by differences in their diet or differences in their migratory behavior or differences in their relatedness. So, for example, the quail and duck here in this bottom left-hand corner, they're doing similar things to many of the songbirds. So the differences are not driven by who they're related to and who their family is. So we found that bill and leg size is consistently increasing through time as the climate warms. We found that this happens across different diet categories, across different migratory behaviors, and across really diverse species. And so we concluded that shape-shifting occurs consistently in Australian birds. Great, case solved. But there's still questions remaining, and I'm sure that that is obvious. One of the questions that I get asked most often with regards to this work is, are the changes actually adapting? If we see changes in beak and leg size through time, does that mean that these birds are coping with climate change? But the real thing is that we don't really know. We don't know if the changes that we've seen are enabling survival in a warming world and if they are actually adaptive and beneficial for the birds. That still is work to be done. We also, as I'm sure you saw, found lots of variability in our species responses. And so this is not all of the species are doing the same thing. They are quite different in what they're doing. But we couldn't find that these were explained by diet or migration. So what does explain the differences between the species? Why aren't they all doing the same thing? So to get at that, we're going to narrow in on physiology for a little while. So let's return to this video of the toucan with his changing beak temperature. And you might say, well, a toucan has a huge beak. It would make sense that it could regulate the beak temperature decently well because it has a gigantic beak. But you can't expect other species to be capable of doing the same thing. So people might assume, okay, well, toucans must be some sort of outlier because they have a huge beak. And it's because they have a huge beak that they have to be able to regulate its temperature. But of course, the reverse is also plausible, that it's the high regulatory ability that they have that enable them to have a large beak. And so that's kind of just an example to hint at what we're trying to look at now, which is, are there differences between species in how well they can control their beak and leg temperature? Is, for example, a magpie better at regulating its beak temperature than a noisy miner, or do they do it to roughly the same extent? And if there are differences between the species, if some species are better at regulating their beak and leg temperature than others, does that explain why some species are increasing beak and leg size through time while others are not? So I'm going to show you some of the work that we have done in this sphere, but it is still preliminary. So this graph here shows air temperature and then the beak and leg temperature and how they change. So as you can see quite broadly, as air temperature increases, so does the beak and leg temperature. They sort of scale upwards. But do the different species do this to a different extent? And I'm going to talk these through quite slowly, but hopefully it becomes obvious what I'm talking about. This graph is similar to the previous one, but it has the air temperature and just the beak temperature. So we're looking at bills here. And as you should be able to see, each of these different dots here represents a different species, each of these big dots here. And so you see here at 10 degrees air temperature, there's quite a lot of variability in how hot the beak is for these different species. And then once we get up to around 20 degrees, all of the species are doing really similar things. They all kind of start clumping together. And then they sort of start separating out again up here at 35 degrees. And so we can see that there's quite a bit of variability in how well different species can control the amount of heat lost through the beak at both cold air temperatures and at hot air temperatures. Now, for the legs, on the other hand, there's overall far less variation in the control they have. So if you compare, for example, here at 10 degrees, all of the species are sort of clumped together and they're doing really the same thing. In the beak, they were all much more spread out. Some species are really good at minimizing heat loss in the cold, and some species are quite bad at it. Whereas for the legs, they're all sort of doing similar things all throughout. So we basically found that there are differences in how well birds can regulate their beak temperature, but not really any differences in how well they can regulate their leg temperature. So, does this influence their changes in body shape through time? And this again is quite preliminary results. As an example, the silver gull had really good control of its beak temperature through changing air temperature. So it could have really good control of how much blood to flow into its beak and then stop flowing it. Now, the silver gull also increased bill size quite a lot through time. So we're finding that that was a bit of a positive relationship. Compare that to the crested pigeon, who, while adorable, was really bad at regulating his beak temperature and also didn't increase beak size through time. So it looks as if birds that are better able to regulate their beak temperature actually are the ones that increase beak size through time as the climate warms. So the ability of the silver gull to keep cool might really help it as the climate changes. So I'm realizing now that I must have really whizzed through this presentation because it's only been half an hour, but we covered a bit of background information about how birds regulate body temperature and how they can use their beaks to regulate and their legs to regulate body temperature. We talked a little bit about the trends through space and time that this leads to. I talked a little bit about the examples I found in the scientific literature of changes in body shape through time as the climate warmed. I then delved into the work we'd done on Australian birds, finding that beak and leg size increase through time as the climate warms. And then I talked a little bit about some of the remaining questions in this sphere and what we're hoping to look into currently and in the future. Thank you all very much for listening, and I want to give a special thank you to my collaborators on this work, notably Alex McQueen, Marcel Clausen, Glenn Tattersall, and Matthew Simons, especially to Matt, who supervised me during this PhD. And I'd be happy to take any questions. Annie, should I stop sharing my screen for the question time, do you think?
Yeah, may as well.
Okay.
Thank you so much for that. That was extremely interesting. I think I'll ask my own question off the bat, which is, so we know that these changes are happening, but what are the implications for species? Why does it matter if bill size might change?
Yeah, so that's a really good question. I think there's sort of two approaches to that question. One of them being what I talked about a little bit in the presentation, which is, are these changes adaptive at all? Oh, sorry, I'm going to try to figure out how to mute the thing.
Sorry.
No, that's okay. Yes, so there's the question of whether these changes are adaptive and are good for the birds. And the answer to that is that we don't really know. The consistency of the changes and them happening through time like this is an indicator that they are evolutionary responses, but we can't actually say for sure that they are yet. It's just that we have an indication that they are. Another thing to, I think, really keep in mind is that we're seeing these changes happen across a really broad spectrum of birds, and we don't really have an understanding of what this means, what the impacts are. And that means that we also don't really understand what the follow-on consequences of these changes are.
Yeah.
So, we can see them happening quite broadly, and that's all well and good, but things like beak size and leg size and also body size in general are tightly linked to a bird's ecology and what they're able to do, in the wild and in their habitat. And so then it's the question of, okay, is this going to have impacts on that, or what are the following effects? That was a very long way of saying that I don't know. I don't think anyone knows, but that is sort of becoming a real. Yeah, it's becoming a real question that everyone's trying to tackle in the sphere and getting into. So I guess stay tuned on the sphere and this sort of area of research, and there should be hopefully some really exciting work coming out in the next few years that will hopefully tackle some of those issues.
I think that's a really good way to emphasize just how complicated it is. And when you hone in on a single species, you might be able to say, well, here are the implications. But when you start looking at a whole process level, that's when it does become really complicated. So we had someone in the audience asked what your thoughts on the species that are not changing are. So that's kind of a related question, but you did particularly flag species of a different dietary group. Were they the nectivorous birds that didn't seem to be showing the same changes? What's happening?
Yes. Yeah, great question. It's going to broadly be another I don't know from me, to be honest. I'm just going to preface that now. I think with the fruit and nectar feeders, one of the sort of drawbacks of the study that I presented here is that we only had 2 species that fit that description. a lot of the other birds that you might think would fit in there were actually omnivores. So we sort of don't have too much power to be able to say why they're doing something different or really what exactly they're doing different. It could be that because we only had two species, we just sort of, that was a bit of a fluke, you know? So I don't want to say too much about what I think the fruit and nectar feeders are doing just because we had so little power to say anything about it. So I don't really know why they're doing things differently. I think that it will be really cool in the future to try to see and figure out, because this like one of the things I had thought originally was, all right, well, fruit and nectar feeders, their beak shape and size might be quite closely tied, or especially closely tied to their feeding, because if you're trying to eat nectar, you kind of can't afford to deviate too much, is at least what I assumed, right? So I'm wondering if there might be something that happens there that sort of restricts that type of change from occurring. And then also to note that we grouped fruit and nectar feeders, so it's not as if we can compare, you know, is a hummingbird who has a really specialized beak and has, you know, potentially adapted to a specific flower or food source. Are they shape-shifting? Because like in the same group, we had birds that eat, you know, fruits in general, and that is presumably a slightly less specialized diet that might have more room for deviation. So I think it'll be really interesting to see if the sort of narrowness of the ecological niche impacts whether they are capable of any morphological change, or if perhaps the morphological change occurs anyway, but then has a bad repercussion on their ability to carry out their ecological niche.
That is extremely interesting to think about, and it ties on to a question that Kat had. Is it possible that some of the birds that did not increase beak size did so because a large change would affect their ability to effectively feed on some food sources? Do you have anything else you want to add to what you've said?
Yeah, maybe I'll take that as an opportunity to delve a little bit more into what gets brought up a lot of times when we talk about beak size and beak shape. People talk a lot about, or people tend to have the first thought of, oh, Darwin's finches. Darwin's finches is a really classical example in evolutionary biology in general and in ornithology of birds whose diet is really closely linked to their beak size and their beak shape, right? So a real tight link between morphology and diet. And so that might cause people to think, oh, well, are you sure the changes that you're seeing are related to climate change? Like, isn't it not make more sense that it's related to diet? And while I think it could be possible that some of the changes we see are potentially driven by diet, I think the fact that we see them so broadly might indicate that they aren't, at least not exclusively, that beaks aren't exclusively driven by diet. And I think that's becoming more and more recognized too, broadly in ornithology, that beaks are complex structures driven by lots of different pressures. I also didn't show this here, but when we were reviewing the scientific literature, we did a bit of a deep dive into a data set that looked at Darwin's finches and looked at selection in them and in their size through time. And the original study was looking at how over the course of a couple of decades, you can see that the population goes from, you know, having a certain beak size and type to another. And they thought, oh, maybe this is related to the diet and stuff like that. And they tied it to rainfall, because rainfall can be an indicator of the seed size that's available. But we reanalyzed our data set with temperature and found that that was actually a better explainer, and showed that beak size increased as temperature increased. And we were able to explain that trend better than using the rainfall metric. So even there, I kind of think that temperature can be an important contributor to beak size and shape. Sorry if that went on for too long, but I got excited.
No, that's perfect. I think that's a good reminder or point to know that things don't occur in a vacuum, right? So both can be having an effect, and that effect could make the visible differences more pronounced or less pronounced, and all of these things can be true at the same time. So that is another challenge for research like yours, to disentangle all of these broad-scale climatic changes with other things. Yes. Sorry, and if I am looking away, it's because I'm trying to keep up with the questions, because you've got a lot of questions. Now, There's one I particularly want to ask. So John and Alison were wondering about the species that didn't show adaptations of beak and leg, and this might be a bit outside your field, but is there evidence that other adaptive strategies are being used, like altitudinal changes?
That is a fantastic question. I'm so glad they asked that.
Good job, John.
Unfortunately, the answer is I don't know, but I'll delve into a little bit more of sort of what we're thinking on this topic, because there was some discussion in the scientific community about, well, should we really expect to see increases in both leg size and bill size? Maybe birds would, quote unquote, choose to increase the size of one as a adaptive strategy that meant they didn't have to increase the size of the other. And so far, we haven't really seen that happening. And that goes as well for some other research that I didn't touch on in this presentation, which is about how overall in animals, and there's lots of examples in birds, bird body size in general is becoming smaller through time as the climate warms. But again, we don't see any sort of trade-off, and it's not as if the birds that are becoming smaller are also doing so, but not changing their beak size. Instead, it seems as if, they can do both or they can do neither, and it's sort of, yeah. So we don't really know if they're using different strategies in that sense. I think another thing that I want to touch on in relation to this is that I think behavioral modifications can be a big thing that can happen. And that is really hard to figure out. And I mean, it's impossible to figure out from museum specimens if there's any changes that happen there. But even in terms of, the types of microhabitat that a bird uses, like a thornbill may take shelter in a bush on a really hot day because the bush will be just slightly cooler than the outside. Whereas a wedge-tailed eagle is kind of resigned to sitting on a branch that's big enough to accommodate it. And so those sort of microhabitat differences might potentially mean that some are more exposed and might have to change more than others. Sorry, I put quotation marks around have to. I just want to make that clear in case people weren't.
I understand. That's the whole thing. Sometimes behavioral adaptations can get in the way of other types of evolution. So then I feel like every question you say, I just respond with, it's really complicated, which is probably not that helpful for our audience. Now, I did want you touched on body size change really briefly when you were discussing that, and we've had a couple of people ask about body size. Prasad was wondering if there's evidence that overall body size is changing as well. And Mick particularly wanted to know about birds with socks, like little eagles. So their feathers increase, heat being retained. So have their socks gotten shorter? Like, are there other particular body parts that might be changing?
Fantastic questions again. So yes, there is widespread evidence for body sizes becoming smaller through time. And the evidence for that is really consistent across different species and across different continents. So decreases in body size have been documented for Australian birds, but also North American birds, birds in the Amazon. I think the exception was a recent study of birds in Africa. But apart from that, there's really consistent decreases in body size that are happening through time and that are linked to warming temperatures. In terms of other traits, I love the sock idea. I haven't heard that proposed before, so that's a really, really good idea. It would definitely be worth looking into.
That could be your PhD.
Yeah, exactly. It could be. We have had some discussion in the lab about other structures that happen. So, for example, when I talked about how birds can use their beaks to regulate their body temperature, some birds also have other structures that are similarly capable of being regulated. So, for example, cassowary casks can be used and can regulate blood flow to them to release temperature. Yeah, so to release heat through them. So those types of structures might also be changing. But as far as I'm aware, I don't know of any studies that have actually looked at that or found changes. So great, fantastic ideas, and I'm sure that will be looked into, but I don't know of any studies that have done that so far. But there's definitely a theoretical basis for why we'd expect to see changes there.
Very interesting. I'm going to do a bit of a change of pace because we've got a couple of methods questions and then we can get back into the concepts. So Prasabi's wondering how you controlled for variability among individuals. So issues with things like small sample size at each of the time points.
Yes, so I had a rigorous data collection plan, and I can talk through that a little bit more now. So the goals of our study were to get a really good diversity of species from across a really good diversity of groups. And we wanted to get through a good time frame as well. And that meant that I went through and looked at what species I could reliably find, you know, a solid dozen individuals per decades through the past century. And from the species that sort of fit that criteria, I also so I talked about this so-called Allen's rule and how there's patterns in bill size through space. So birds in colder environments have smaller beaks than those in warmer environments. So to minimize that influence, I also tried to only get specimens that were collected from a really narrow locational range so that I could be sure that any changes that happened were because of changes through time, not due to any sort of weird sampling thing. I looked at if there were any differences depending on, you know, what month of the year the bird had been collected, because some traits can fluctuate throughout the year. For example, especially mass can be known to fluctuate like that. And I looked at if there were differences depending on the sex of the bird. So, you know, maybe if it was happening in males but not females. But again, none of those things turned out to really be important. So yeah, we really tried to avoid any types of those biases coming into it. So that should be, should have been, you know, there's a restriction in how much you can remove those types of things when you're working with a museum collection, because, you know, you're kind of, what you get is what you get. You get what you get and you don't get upset is sort of, you know, the attitude. But we did try to sort of minimize all those other confounds from influencing it. And where we couldn't sort of minimize it, I could instead control for it statistically and found that it didn't influence the trends that we saw through time. But great question, yeah.
And similarly, Claire was wondering how you control for shrinkage on the dead or dehydrated specimens, especially if they're really vascular.
Yeah. Fantastic question. Yeah, in case people don't know, when you first collect a bird to use or to taxidermy for a museum, in the first few years after you've collected it and after you've taxidermied it, it'll shrink, which it can present a very obvious issue when trying to do a study like this, which is why we had a cutoff period. And so we didn't use any specimen that had been collected after, I think it was 2014 or 2016. And since I was collecting, or since I was looking at specimen in the museum in 2022 and onwards, that meant that there was, you know, a really solid period of time between when they were collected and when I measured them. And since the shrinkage occurs really in the first couple of weeks to months after the bird was taxidermied, that should have been well and truly eliminated from what was happening. So fantastic point, great question, but yeah, that should not be an issue in our study.
So standardized levels of shrinkage. I'm going to go back to some more kind of climate change conceptual questions. Rex has just got a really easy question. So how do you think your research could be used to influence the climate change debate? Just a simple one.
Yeah, great question. So the paper that we published in 2021 that got a lot of attention on Twitter and to the media, that was in the lead up to COP21, right? So the big climate change summit. And I mean, don't get me wrong, I'm not going to sit here and say that my research is going to save the world, and it, you know, it's not going to do that. We all know that. We know it's not going to do that. But I think that research like this can form a neat and perhaps not tangible is not the right word, but like a really neat and sort of concise account of exactly how climate change influences wildlife on a really broad scale. And just, you know, to keep in mind that a lot of times when we talk about climate change and the impact that it has on the world, people's first thought tends to be like, oh, yep, okay, we need to make sure that people and humans are protected from its impacts, which is, of course, super important. And that is obviously going to be the first instinct. And I think that these types of studies just provide a good reminder that wildlife can't really can't really mitigate climate change the way that some human technologies are trying to. And instead, they just have to cope with it. And one of the things that I find so, I guess, frightening with my research is that we're looking over a time span of 100 years, and we're seeing these changes across these different species, including all of the, statistical noise that this type of study is going to bring with it. We're still seeing it happen. And so I think that, if anything, we're probably underestimating the impact that climate change is having on these guys. So I hope that this research can form a neat example to put to policymakers to say, look, this is what climate change does. This is one of the things climate change does to wildlife, and is another reason why we need to combat climate change.
It's scary how much evidence is collected for it to just be a really tiny piece of the narrative, but I guess it's necessary.
Yeah, I mean, I'm super happy for it to be a piece of a narrative if that helps further the narrative.
That's touche. Jan and Liz both asked similar questions about climate change having other effects on things like food sources. So could it be that the effects are on the available food sources, and that's what's having an effect on beak size?
Yeah, fantastic questions. And these were things that we thought of as well. So I have two sort of, I guess, approaches to that question. The first one being that one of the ideas we had in terms of why we wanted to have such diverse diet categories or diet sources is because it would be unlikely that all 5 of those diet categories would be changing in a way that would make bigger beaks the go-to alternative. I also spoke to some botanists and stuff like that to figure out okay, well, if we look at it on a really macroevolution scale, has, for example, seed size changed through time? And so far, the sort of morphological impacts of climate change on plants, none of that has indicated from the botanists that I spoke to that there are changes in seed size, nor did the botanists that I spoke to think that that would be a thing. So because of the diversity of food sources that we had, and from my experience talking to the botanists that have sort of looked at some of these types of questions, it doesn't seem as if that would be the cause behind the morphological changes that we've seen in birds.
Thank you. Still on diet, Andre was wondering if shorebirds' beaks are adapted to the depth of their prey in mudflats, what does a larger beak do?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And when I was talking about how we'd gone through the literature to find examples of changes in beak size through time, one of the examples was on red knots, and they do use their beaks to probe for food at certain depths in the mud. And so in that sense, that has a very real link to their feeding source. So and I have just recently, my postdoc currently is on shorebirds, so I'm sort of getting into that sphere as opposed to more general broad ornithology. My impression so far is that that small beaks could be quite a bad thing, right? Because that might mean that other food sources are out of your reach, and that could be a really bad thing. So longer beaks shouldn't have a deleterious impact on their ability to reach food, at least is my current understanding. And then I also don't know, because I think another thing that we need to keep in mind with these things all being systems that are interconnected is, how are the actual invertebrates that those shorebirds are feeding on, how are they responding to climate change? Are they burrowing at the same depth as they used to? These are things that we don't really know yet. So it's kind of, so yeah, so I think it's a really interesting point. Yeah.
Still on food and diet, Mitchell was wondering, I think more in general, with the evolution of birds, do we know the birds and flowers are interacting with each other to affect the size and shape of appendages or of flowers?
The only examples I know of that happening are the hummingbirds, but I assume that it happens more broadly too. Sorry, this is kind of going further out into a more macroevolutionary diet thing, and I don't really know the answer to it.
I was going to throw a little cheeky promo in after this. So last month, we actually had a pollination ecologist come and speak. So we had a whole birds meet session on how birds and Australian plants co-evolved and the impact of things like honeybees, because pollination occurs in different ways. So for anyone who is wondering about whether there is an association there, they can go and watch last month's webinar. But the answer in general is yes. But what Sarah and research right now doesn't know is, I think, whether there is an additional effect of climate change that impacted, that you touched on earlier, that botanists don't seem to think that there's an effect, but it might be a bit of a question mark area.
Yeah. I'm gonna have to go back and watch that recording. That's great.
Well, I loved it. I don't know anything about all of our guest speakers' fields, so I'm always enjoying it. Andre wants to know, maybe contentious, would you call this supercharged evolution?
Ooh, so I would, yeah, so I guess it's sort of, like I sort of said a little bit earlier, the changes happening like this over a large time frame and across different species and things like that, that's indicative of there being evolutionary changes. But to demonstrate that it's evolution, we need to demonstrate that it's, adaptive, that it gives better fitness, that it heightens fitness, and that it's heritable. And there's all these different sort of facets need to be shown. We know that bill size is a heritable trait. So if a mama bird has a big beak, baby bird is probably going to have a big beak. But we also know that beaks grow to different sizes depending on what the temperature is. So beaks are what we call developmentally plastic. If you raise a bird in a hot temperature, it'll grow a bigger beak. Whereas if you raise it in a cold temperature, it won't. So in that sense, we can't really know if the changes that we've seen here through time are because they are all being influenced by that developmental plasticity and growing larger beaks, or if it's because there's an adaptive benefit to having bigger beaks, there's higher fitness involved with it, and that's inheritable and passed on to their young. So my current sort of impression and opinion of the science around this so far is that I think that there might be a decently strong evolutionary component to these changes. And but there's definitely also developmental plasticity that can occur and that probably does occur. So it's a bit of a, I wouldn't call it supercharged evolution or turbocharged evolution, but I wouldn't say it's not evolution. Sort of. Is that a cop out, or can I say that?
I was just thinking that's a very rational scientific response to not saying anything like salacious, but I understand what you mean, because we don't actually know for sure, so you can't say anything.
Yeah.
Now, have we already touched on things going southwards? Have we already had questions about that? Claire's wondering if climate change is driving populations of birds and other species like trees southwards or northwards in the northern hemisphere to cooler climates. Do you?
Yes.
Yeah.
Oh, sorry.
No, that was the question. Thank you.
Yeah, no, there is definitely evidence of that happening. There's evidence of distributions of not just birds, but animals in general moving to more poleward latitudes as those latitudes become more thermally accessible, or that climate becomes better suited for them and they can move there. There's also evidence of it happening on a altitudinal range. So birds will move higher up a mountain as the climate warms, and sort of let's say you have a snow-capped mountain, the amount of mountaintop that's actually snow-capped is going to decrease and decrease and decrease as the climate warms, and so birds can move further up. That, of course, means very bad news for the birds who have evolved to live right at the top of the mountain, or for the birds who have evolved to live right at the poles. They have nowhere to go. And that presents a massive issue in ecology and in general, and is fully outside of my area of expertise. So I'll just leave it there and just say, yes, I know that there is evidence of that happening, but yeah.
It's happening and it's scary, I think. Is
very scary.
Sort of. Harry was wondering if these processes have been seen in island ecosystems.
Oh, fantastic question. Fantastic question. And so I haven't looked at that as part of my own research specifically, right? Because I'm kind of focusing more broadly in Australia and stuff. But I have read some studies that have looked at island systems. And island systems, they do weird things, right? Because it's all just on the one island and it can kind of spawn all kinds of wacky evolutionary trajectories, which is really cool in of itself. I have read some papers that have said that the influence of climate on body and bill size is stronger than that of the island effect. So they had this study system where they could tease apart how much those different things are adding to the overall morphology of the bird. And they found that the influence of temperature was higher than that of the island effect. I'll also go back to the thing that I touched on earlier, which was about the Darwin's finches and how their beak size, when we reanalyzed another snippet of data, we found that we could explain variation in beak size in Darwin's finches more reliably using temperature and lower rainfall. Now, the fact that it's an island system means that it seems that those changes can occur quite like rapidly, which is in and of itself really interesting. But yeah, it's a fantastic question, and I'm sure there will be lots more to tease apart when it comes to island systems, but I haven't done any research on that personally.
Now we're at time, so I'm not going to be able to get through all of the questions because there were so many, but I reckon I can sneak in just a couple more. You touched on this a bit obliquely earlier, but Tanika's wondering if heat waves can lead to leaps in beak size or body changes for the next generation, those extreme weather events.
Yeah, so that's a fantastic question, right? Because those heat wave events, and I don't know, I'm assuming that people here might be familiar with, the massive mortality event that happened a few years ago with the budgies. So when we have these heat wave events, massive amounts of birds might die all at once. And then it's kind of up to the survivors who are then able to actually reproduce and pass on their genes. Now, whether there is a survival benefit when you have a large beak during an extreme heat wave event like that, I don't really know. And in my opinion, which again, I haven't researched this yet, so I don't have a solid answer for you. My opinion of what I've read in the scientific literature so far is that I think a mass mortality event like that would just wipe out so many different birds. And I think that the deciding factor of whether a bird survived that type of event or not would be how much water they had access to and how much food they had access to. Because if there's a massive heat event, what birds have to do is just kind of sit around and hope that it passes. And that means that you can't forage and you can't go look for water. And one of the main ways that birds lose heat is through panting. And when you use that panting behavior in birds, they use water to lose that. So I think actually that I don't necessarily know if I think beak and leg size would be the deciding factor of who does and doesn't survive a heat wave event. So I don't necessarily know if I think it would lead to the sort of microevolutionary trends that we think we're seeing here, if that makes sense.
Thank you. Now, does climate change affect other factors like the amount of offspring? Is there differences in fecundity?
Yeah, so that's a great question. And there's a paper that was published earlier this year that looked at these things, and they looked at how both extreme heat events or abnormal heat events, so like just warmer than usual, and abnormal cold events influence things like fledgling success. So, how many of the chicks actually fledge to adulthood. And yeah, they find that if it gets hotter, the fledgling success is lower. But also, if it gets colder, the fledgling success gets lower. So that kind of means that if you're in an environment where both heat waves and cold snaps are increasing in frequency, it just spells bad news for breeding success in general in these birds. But these sort of things are also sort of dependent on what their breeding strategy is, right? So like if you have let's say you have a pigeon and they're prolific breeders and might have multiple clutches in a year and they'll lay tons of young and that will be great. Compare that to, for example, a hooded plover, which lays one egg at a time, as far as I'm aware. And they might do that multiple times a year, but they only just have always the one egg. And that kind of means that the dynamics of temperature and extreme events on their breeding success is slightly different. And so there's sort of nuances in how we should approach these types of questions. I don't know if I answered the question there, actually.
No, wonderfully. So we'll just have one last question, and I'm so sorry to everyone who we didn't get a chance to touch on, but hopefully everyone got something out of this question time. What would you want people to go and do with this information for people who have sat here and learnt this in the last hour?
Yeah, that's a fantastic question. I think, gosh, yeah,
It's another really easy, simple one, yeah.
No, I mean, I hope that people found this really interesting, and hopefully it can, as we sort of talked about what the actual real world impact of this type of research is, I hope it can form a nice example that people can use to say, no, look, this is how climate change influences birds in general. I think as well, it's important to sort of become aware of this and how, because this research really indicates that birds are quite exposed to climate change and that they're really being heavily influenced by it. And so hopefully this can form a neat example of that. I'll also add in just two things that I feel passionately about. First one being of that, yeah, we really need to do more about climate change. If this is what's happening already so far, as I mentioned earlier, I only measured specimens that were collected from 2016 and then earlier. And so that means that climate change has still continued to occur in the years since then, and is probably going to continue, especially if we don't do anything. So I think this sort of situation is going to continue to get worse, and I think it's really important that we recognize that and try to do more to deal with it. I also want to do another thing that I feel quite strongly about personally, which is go visit your museums. Go visit your local museum. Museums are a fantastic scientific resource, and the research that I've done and a lot of the research that I talked about would not have been possible without museums. And unfortunately, museums are underfunded and underappreciated. And despite the fact that they form such an important scientific institution, so go support your local museums. That'd be my takeaway.
I love that. What a fantastic takeaway. Sorry, it's been amazing. And thank you so much for handling all of those completely out of left field questions. I really appreciate it. Thank you for your time. I'm going to end the webinar now, but we will pop it up on YouTube in the coming days for anyone who wants to have a look. And I hope everyone goes and enjoys their night. See you later.
See you guys. Thanks.